it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. The Kanontsistontie, the Flying Head. Sheriff Deputy Jeremy Patterson pulled into the long dirt driveway that led to the Williams family farm. The summer of 1970 was brutal, and Jeremy was cursing under his breath about how lucky the New York State Police were to have AC in their cars. Jeremy loved his hometown of Malone and was proud to be a lawman in Franklin County, but that didn't stop him from wishing his county had a little more money in the budget to get AC for all the sheriff's vehicles. Even with all the windows down and a fan blowing right into his face, Jeremy was sweating so much he felt like he was losing weight. The dirt pathway to the farmhouse wasn't particularly long or winding, but it was very uneven, and bouncing around in his car as he seemed to hit every pothole only helped to sour Jeremy's mood. He didn't want to be here, doing what May had asked him to do. Now, May was an old and very good friend, though, and after the tragedy that had occurred to the family, Jeremy couldn't find it in himself to turn her plea down. Besides, with what information May had given him, if the situation with George wasn't diffused now, it had the possibility of blowing up into something that would rock the state, maybe even the nation. Jeremy's cruiser rolled to a stop outside a bright green house. Normally the place was a sight of joy and care. The couple's children would be outside, running around and laughing while playing games with each other and the family's dogs. George would be out in the fields or working on some farm equipment, and May would have all the windows open and the smell of pies or cakes would be thick in the air. Now the farm had an air of melancholy and despair. No children or dogs were outside. George could not be seen anywhere, and all the windows were shut and boarded up from the inside. Tragedy had hit this family hard, and Jeremy had to swallow his own sorrow and pity before getting out of the car. The sun beat down cruelly on Jeremy as he crossed the front yard to the porch. Climbing the old wooden steps, the sound of dogs barking from within greeted him as he went to the front door and knocked loudly. He waited patiently as the only sound he heard in response was the barking intensifying. Suddenly he could hear multiple chains and bolts being undone on the other side of the thick oak door. It opened slightly, and May Williams looked through the crack at him with a face full of apprehension, before the sight of him drained the worry from her face and a smile appeared as she opened the door fully. "Hello, Jeremy," she said in a quiet and thankful voice, embracing him in a tight hug. She used to give him hugs like that all the time when they were kids, as she had no siblings growing up, and Jeremy was the big brother that she'd never had. He returned the hug to the little sister he'd never had, before breaking apart and smiling down at her. "You're looking well, all things considered." "You're very kind to say that, even though you're lying through your teeth." She wasn't wrong. She looked worn and weary. The tolls of loss and lack of support were destroying her once beautiful hair and shimmering eyes. At least Jeremy heard some fire left in her words, but who knows how much longer that would last. Jeremy didn't want to see her suffering alone anymore, so he decided to get right to the point. Face hardening, he asked, "Is he in the house?" The smile vanished from her face, and a pained grimace replaced it. "No, he's out in the barn. He no longer lives in the house. He spends every night and day there, except for the few times he's gone out for supplies." This voice came out in a whisper, and Jeremy could hear the loneliness and sorrow that echoed in her words. He nodded determinedly. "I'll go out and have a long talk with him. Don't know how much good I'll do, but hopefully I can get him back in the house at least. Have him see his children and wife." "Oh, do be careful, Jeremy. He hasn't acted violent around any of us, or any of our other friends that have tried to talk to him. But with that arsenal surrounding him..." She faded off as her two remaining children came to the door to see who their mother was talking to. Ben had just become a teenager not 3 months ago, and Jessica was only 2 years behind him. They both knew Jeremy, as he'd been to a few family parties over the years, and normally they'd be enthusiastic about seeing him and asking if he'd busted any bad guys yet. Now they just stared at him with a gaunt and hollow look. It was an expression Jeremy had seen before, but never on children. They weren't a lot, but the few of the town veterans who'd returned from Vietnam, who he'd been busting for public drunkenness and smoking pot, all seemed to bear that look. Jeremy could tell the children saw something that had thoroughly fucked with their heads. "Don't worry, May. I'll make sure that everything and everyone keeps calm. George is a reasonable man, good husband and loving father. I'm sure he'll see the light." "Thank you, Jeremy. If there's anything I can ever do to repay you..." "Don't say that just yet. I'm no psychologist. Just promise me you'll get some rest no matter how this situation ends." Jeremy dropped his gaze to the two children. He gave them a warm smile. "I'm going to try and get your daddy back in the house, all right? Now, if he does come in, make sure you both tell him you love him very much and try to make him happy, all right? He'll need your strength." As Jeremy turned to walk off the porch, Ben spoke up from behind his mother. "He means to hunt it, sir." Jeremy stopped at this and looked at Ben. "Why was that now?" he asked. "When I asked him what he was doing, he told me he was gathering weapons to hunt that monster with." Ben gave the floor a defeated look. "When I told him I wanted to help, he kicked me out of his workshop and told me that me and Jess were forbidden from going into the barn. He said as much as he wanted to kill the monster, he'd die before he was going to let it get to the rest of us, so we were to stay in the house with Mom and not come out until it was safe to do so." Jeremy nodded, wondering if he'd see the same expression the children wore on the face of George. "Well, thanks for letting me know, Ben," he replied, and stepped off the porch to make his way to the barn. The fields where crops were usually grown with care seemed abandoned and forlorn. As Jeremy walked the 100 or so yards to the faded red barn behind the house, he noticed the whole farm seemed to have a sense of decay and rot about it. Paint was peeling off the barn and house. A tractor was sitting out in the field gathering rust. What crops had been planted were left to wither and die, and crows seemed to lie the entire tree line near the edge of the property that led into the forest. It was disheartening to see a place that had once been so filled with life and love become diseased with death and heartache. As Jeremy neared the barn, the sounds of hammering reached his ears, growing only louder the closer he got. Finally, he got to the barn doors and opened them, not bothering to knock because it wouldn't have been heard over the metallic din. The first thing that Jeremy noticed was the smell of machined metal and oil. The second thing he noticed was the vast amount and array of firearms plastered against the walls and strewn across the floor. There were guns of all different sizes from all different time periods in history. Muskets, double-barrel shotguns, and dueling pistols were next to Wild West-style revolvers and carbines. A lot of the guns looked rusted and basically useless, but a few seemed restored and brand new. In the middle of it all was George, a homemade forge now in the middle of the barn. He was shirtless and dirty, busy hammering away at a piece of metal that looked like it could be a barrel of a rifle. Jeremy waited till George paused in the hammer swings before calling out, "Hey, George, how you doing?" George briefly looked up from his work. His face wore a mask of hard determination as he returned Jeremy's look. "Deputy Patterson," he gruffly spoke in greeting, before going back to hammering on the piece of metal he was working on. Jeremy took a few steps closer to George and waited again for him to stop hammering the metal. "Say, George, I was wondering if you had a little time to talk." George grunted briefly as he put the hammered metal back into the forge. "I don't have much to talk about, Deputy, but if you want to talk, I won't stop you, just as long as you don't interrupt my work." George worked his homemade bellows, and the fire in the furnace roared as it began heating the metal red hot. Jeremy had to take his hat off and wipe his brow. It was hot enough already, being in the middle of the day, and the forge being in this barn made the heat almost unbearable. "George, I can't imagine what you're going through right now, and I'm not going to try and tell you that everything will be okay. But May and Ben and Jess, well, they need you right now. May needs her husband's shoulder to mourn on, and your children need a father to care for them and tell them everything's going to be all right, even if you know that's a lie." George did pause in his work. He looked at Jeremy thoughtfully, and then down to the straw-covered wooden floor in thought. "Well, in other circumstances, I'd probably say that you're right. I'd be in the house with my family right now. I want to be in the house with my wife and children right now." A sudden wave of anger, hatred, and conviction came over George's expression. "But after what I saw and what it did to little Jim, the best thing I can do for my family is make sure that son of a bitch is dead." He then resumed pulling on the bellows and heating up the metal. Jeremy sighed and moved closer still, braving the heat that was making him sweat profusely. "You know, we spent the whole month coming over those woods for that bear. Not just the other deputies and the sheriff, but forest rangers and an army of volunteer hunters. We have no clue what happened to it or where it went, but it's not within 100 miles of you or your family. You think you're going to be able to arm yourself to the teeth and just track it down, hunt it and kill it? How'd you even know which bear it was that killed your son?" For a few minutes, there was silence between the two men. George got lost in his work, banging on the rifle barrel with his blacksmith hammer while Jeremy watched a man going insane from grief. He was just about to break the dry spell of speech between the two when George beat him to it. "It wasn't a bear that killed little Jim." His voice shook with rage, but also there was a discernible twinge of fear mixed in with the words. Jeremy was taken aback by George's proclamation. "What?" was all he could manage. "I said it wasn't a bear that killed little Jim. Can you think of a bear that would devour a kid in one bite, leaving only a shoe with a foot in it? Can you think of a bear that could open its jaws wide enough to stuff a 4'5" kid in its mouth with only 1 foot sticking out of the entirety of its jaws? I know what killed my son. My kid saw it too, and it wasn't a bear." That had probably been one of the most disturbing things about the case that Jeremy could remember. The fact that only 1 foot remained of little Jim was horrible enough, but the idea that the whole rest of him had been eaten, and yet somehow there was no blood spatters or trails of gore beyond the remaining foot of little Jim. "Look, you said in your official police report that it was a bear. A giant black bear, George. And that has to be it. There's nothing else out there that could possibly do that to anyone." "It wasn't a fucking bear," roared George, causing Jeremy to take a step back with his hand instinctively reaching to his sidearm. George quieted down at his reaction and solemnly set his hammer down. He took a few moments to gather his thoughts before he quietly continued. "Yeah, I lied on the official report because no one would believe me if I said what I actually saw. Everyone would call me crazy, and at best I'd be shipped to a loony bin somewhere. And so I lied and said that I saw a giant black bear, but, well, that wasn't what I saw." A pained look came across his face, and the internal agony going on in his mind and heart was visible to Jeremy. "Even I thought I was crazy at first. There's no way I could have seen what I saw. I went to our local library and looked up different forms of crazy, but don't seem to fit with any of them. I went to Reverend Davis. He told me us Protestants don't believe in demons as monsters. They're more as sins of man. So I went downstate and found a Catholic priest. Asked him about demons taking physical forms in this world. He scoffed, said it was highly unlikely. Yeah, and even if they did manage to make it to this physical plane, they needed a body to possess if they wanted to inflict death and destruction to man." George's eyes became somewhat wild as he remembered his own madness. "I was at the end of my rope, ready to turn myself into one of the loony bins, before I made one last effort to find some answers. I went a little farther north and visited the St. Regis Mohawk Reservation. I never thought that one day I'd be visiting there, but there I was. I paid my way to see the medicine man or whatever, and I told him what I saw." George looked up then into Jeremy's eyes, the light of insanity almost completely enveloping his own. "He told me It was a flying head. Jeremy had been leaning in closer since George had begun his tale, but his last statement had him recoil in surprise and confusion. I'm sorry, George. A what? A flying head, Jeremy. They had some Indian name for it, but I can't remember how it's said. Well, I don't speak Mohawk, George said steadily. He then suddenly burst out laughing. You should see your face. Yeah, I can't really blame you. I imagine I had the same face when I was first told about the flying head. George's laugh died in his throat, and he continued to explain in a low, coarse voice. Then the medicine man described to me what the flying head looks like, and it matches perfectly to what I saw eating my son alive. George swallowed hard, eyes squinting back tears as he remembered watching the death of his youngest son. He had thick, shaggy black hair. In that aspect, it looks like a black bear, but it had big talons like a hawk or a falcon, and it had giant bat wings that it used to swoop down on little Jim. Through the black fur, I saw a giant face. It was the size of a man's torso, and it was warped and twisted into this horrible visage of a mockery of a human face. I can still remember his smile as it raised little Jim to his maw filled with razor-sharp teeth, its eyes never leaving me as I ran to little Jim in a useless effort to save him. One bite, and all that was left of my son was his little shoe with the foot. George's face darkened as animosity flooded his features, then flew away into the forest, cackling horribly as I reached what remained of my little boy. George shook his head sadly and picked up his hammer and the barrel of the rifle he'd been working on. I'm truly thankful for everyone's effort to find little Jim's killer. You and everyone scoured the ground for miles looking for this bastard, and I can never repay your kindness and pity towards me and my own. But no one ever looked in the tops of the trees. George then set the hammer and rifle barrel on his makeshift anvil and began heating up the furnace with the bellows again. Jeremy stared in stunned silence. When he'd first walked into the barn, he'd suspected George of becoming crazy. Now he truly wondered if George had already gone off the deep end, and if he was a true danger to his family and others. George had always been a calm and peaceful man, except for his little drinking problem a few years ago, and he'd conquered that. Jeremy knew the death of a child can change a person drastically. Well, he hadn't done anything yet, so we couldn't arrest him, but with a number of guns and ammo being stored in that barn, George could have supplied a group of at least 25, if not 50, by the time he was done repairing all the broken guns. Jeremy knew he had to tread carefully with his words now. George, I'm not calling you crazy, but you do realize how crazy that sounds, right? I mean, a monster from an old Indian legend came out of the woods and ate your boy. It was nighttime, and like you said, both this flying head and the black bear have black fur. I know you're disappointed that we never found the feral bear that caused you grief, but claiming some giant head with bat wings swooped down and ate little Jim. Jerry moved closer to George, who had again stopped his bellows and was listening intently to Jeremy. Your fields are dying, George. Your kids are scared and your wife is sick with grief. You need to be there for them, not gearing up to hunt some crazy Mohawk legend. The town wants to help your family, but only you can be the glue that holds them together. George sighed and directed his gaze into the fire of the furnace. Do you know why I'm collecting and repairing old guns instead of buying new ones? He asked, continuing before Jeremy could even utter a word. It's because of a story the medicine man told me. There's no tale of anyone killing a flying head, but one woman managed to drive it away, supposedly forever. She did this by tricking the flying head into eating hot coals, thinking they were acorns. The flying head was in such agony that it shrieked and flew away, never to bother the woman or her tribe again. George looked away from the fire, a light of determination and gusto in his eyes. There's no firearm that shoots hot coals, so I'm going to use these old guns to fire huge hot pieces of lead. Shoot that bastard so many times it'll have more holes than Swiss cheese. Jeremy sighed. It seemed like his words were not going to reach George, no matter what. He had an idea of what to do, but he didn't want to go through with it. However, remembering May's haggard look and the hollow eyes of the children, he internally gritted his teeth and decided to follow through with it. "All right, George, how about I make you a deal? This Saturday, you and I'll go hunting this flying head. We'll spend the entire day and night looking for this creature, and if we find it, we'll make sure to kill it. However, if we don't find it in all our searching, you'll stop working on all these guns and go back to your family and your farm. How's that sound?" George looked up at Jeremy, a strange smile across his face. Trying to appease the crazy guy, eh? I know the game." The smile quickly vanished and George sighed, looking into the fire of the furnace again. "I don't suppose I'll be able to convince any of the townsfolk to come hunting with me. Collecting all these guns seemed like wasted time now. I was hoping maybe the flying head would go after someone else's family before I was finished fixing them all. Maybe then I could convince enough people to gather around and, well, it was a foolish wish, and a selfish one at that. I mean, I wouldn't want anyone I know to see their child eaten right in front of them." George tore his gaze away from the fire and walked up to Jeremy. "When we do this Saturday, I want you to take this seriously, acting like you're just fulfilling the wishes of a madman. Believe that you and I are actually hunting this monster, a monster that's killed May's youngest. Promise me that, you got yourself a deal." George's face was filled with a calm stoicism, and he extended his hand to Jeremy. Jeremy was a little shocked about how calm and rational George was suddenly being, after raving over an Indian monster of myth not 1 minute ago. George's words rang strongly inside Jeremy's heart. Monster or not, something had killed May's youngest son and brought misery to the entire family. It wasn't going to happen, but if there was a miracle that the two came across whatever it was that ended little Jimmy's life, Jeremy did want to be there to watch the life drain from whatever the bastard was. He took George's outstretched hand and shook it firmly. "All right, George. You'll have my full cooperation and support Saturday. Heck, we can even go into Sunday morning. But if our search yields nothing by noon on Sunday, you keep your end of the deal no matter how cheated or angry you feel." George nodded and went back to stoke the flames of the furnace. Jeremy was left with nothing else to do but bid George a farewell, the sounds of the hammer ringing on the old rifle barrel following him out of the barn. Well, 3 days passed within a blink of an eye, and at 7 a.m. on Saturday morning, Jeremy found himself outside the Williams family front door again. Well, May hadn't been very satisfied when Jeremy told her of the deal he'd brokered with George. She was afraid that the two men would find whatever had killed her youngest son, and then she'd be without a husband and a lifelong friend. Jeremy did his best to both assure her that they probably wouldn't find this creature George had talked about, but also if they did find little Jim's killer, they'd have plenty of firepower to take it down, whatever or whoever it may be. He could tell from the moment May opened the front door and let him inside that, even after 3 days had passed, she still wasn't convinced. To his surprise, he saw George at the dining room table. He'd cleaned up since Jeremy had last seen him. He'd gotten a haircut and at least one shower, but more noticeably he was talking to his children quietly at the table, was in the middle of smiling when Jeremy walked in. Upon his eyes catching sight of Jeremy, however, the smile vanished from George's face, and the grim determination Jeremy had seen in their last meeting returned. "Morning, Jeremy," he said gruffly. Jeremy replied as cheerfully as he could with a "Morning, George. You sure do look a lot better than the last time I saw you." George merely nodded and pulled a seat back next to him, motioning for Jeremy to sit beside him. Jeremy took a seat while May went into the kitchen, ushering the two children along with her. Having sat down, Jeremy could see that the dining room table, besides one plate with George's mostly eaten breakfast on it, contained different charts and maps on it. Some of the maps looked very old, and some were barely more than hand-drawn. Jeremy grimaced as he realized he was somewhat familiar with those woods. He and a large part of the New York State Police Force had been involved in a massive search within those woods 2 years ago, and it was a case that Jeremy did not want to remember. Jeremy would have commented on how many maps George had, but George began explaining different routes he'd made before Jeremy had the chance to speak. They were to start heading northwest from the farmhouse. From there, after 10 miles, they would cut dead east for about 15 miles. After that, they would head southwest for 9 miles. The idea was the two men would slowly be making a sort of spiral pattern inward until they reached the center coordinates. None of the maps displayed any sort of distinguishing marks or places of note on those coordinates, and Jeremy asked George why that was their centralized goal. George paused for a moment in his explanation. "I just have this gut feeling, Jeremy," he said slowly. "I don't know why, but something's telling me we'll find the flying head here. That's why we're making a big spiral around that area first, though. If we can find traces of it somewhere else on the spiral, it'll be easier to get a sense of direction than if we just headed to the coordinates and didn't find anything." Jeremy had to agree, but still wanted to know what made George so sure of that random spot in the woods. George had no answer, and before Jeremy could push him on it, May entered the dining room with a big plate of bacon, eggs, sausage, and toast for Jeremy. "I don't care if it'll take time away from your little hunt. You boys are going to need your strength, and if I know Jeremy, he's only had coffee this morning," May firmly declared as George began to protest. Jeremy had to hold in a chuckle, as May was 100% correct in her assumption. George's further protest died in his throat as May crossed her arms and gave him a stern look, daring him to say what he had planned. Instead, George actually laughed. He stood and smiled at May before looking down at Jeremy. "Oh, I'm sure you've seen this look as many times as me. Changing her mind when she gets like this is like trying to push water uphill with a rake." George closed the distance to May and took her in a loving embrace. Sneaking a quick glance, Jeremy saw that May's face was a bag of mixed emotions. Joy from being in her husband's arms again. Longing, as this may have been the first time he'd held her since the tragedy, and she wanted more. And despair. She finally had a shoulder to cry on for the loss of her son, and it took all her strength not to break down there and then. And hope that she might finally have her husband change back to the man she'd fallen in love with, and the family could begin to heal. It all disappeared from her face when George let her go and turned back to Jeremy. "You get your strength up, Jeremy. I'll be outside prepping our gear. We've got a long day and night ahead of us." George then left the house through the front door, May watching him all the while. When Jeremy began digging into his breakfast, May looked at him pleadingly. "Please, don't let George do anything crazy. I need him, and the children need him. I don't know what I'd do if something happened to him." She was almost in tears, and Jeremy stopped eating before getting up and giving her a reassuring hug. "Don't worry, May. I'll bring him home," he said gently, and May nodded. She wiped her eyes clear of tears before they fell and gave Jeremy a smile. "Now, finish your breakfast. As George said, you two have got a long day ahead of you." After finishing his food, Jeremy strolled outside to see George waiting for him, 2 backpacks full of gear at his feet. George now looked the part of a cowboy straight out of a western. A wide-brimmed hat protected his face and neck from the scorching summer sun, with a leather vest and chaps covering the rest of him, even though they weren't going to be riding any horses. A thick leather belt at his waist housed 2 holsters at either side, each filled with a revolver. An ammo belt crossed his shoulders, filled with shotgun shells that looked like they fit into the large double-barreled shotgun he held in his hands. Jeremy could also clearly see the handle of a large knife protruding from both of George's boots. "Damn, George, you look like you're ready to go toe-to-toe with John Wayne." Jeremy tried to give a smile, but George's serious face stopped it short. "Well, when we find this thing, I plan to make sure it's Dad's. You seem a little light on firearms yourself there, Deputy. Would you like to borrow a rifle?" Jeremy patted the .357 revolver he had in his own belt holster. "No thanks, George. If whatever we're after can take a blast from your shotgun and 6 shots from my piece and keep coming, I don't think a rifle would help either of us much." George simply shrugged, pulled one of the packs over his shoulder. Jeremy walked up beside him and slung the other pack over his shoulder. It was a hefty load, but not too overbearing. "What's in these packs?" asked Jeremy. "Supplies, in case we end up staying out in the forest for a little longer than we might think," replied George. "I'd rather be safe than sorry, if you know what I mean." "Remember, we're looking for 24 hours, George. After that, if we find nothing, you're fulfilling your end of the deal." "Hey, I remember, Jeremy. As I said, the supplies are in case something happens, that's all." With a nod, Jeremy accepted George's explanation. "All right, then. Lead the way." The trek into the woods was hot and exhausting. Jeremy was thankful of May's insisted breakfast, as he needed all the energy he could muster to keep up with George's pace. George was walking like the heat of the day had no effect on him whatsoever. With his shotgun under one arm and a map in the opposite hand, George made his way through the forest, his head moving up and down as he balanced his sight between looking at the ground to see where he was going and looking up into the trees. Jeremy was thankful George had packed a decent amount of water in the packs, and though Jeremy drank a lot to keep hydrated, after about 5 miles he insisted they stop to take a quick breather. George didn't like that, but he allowed it to happen. He stood still and silent, staring into the tops of the trees around them as Jeremy sat on a rock to catch his breath. "So, George, since I'm keeping my end of the bargain and taking this seriously, have you got any more info you can spare me about this flying head you said killed little Jim?" Jeremy asked, after he'd recovered a little. Well, this seemed to awaken George from his watch, and he sat down next to Jeremy, though he kept his eyes still on the treetops. "I got some, but you can probably guess there aren't many books on it that I could find in the library. From what I read and was told, there are 2 different stories on how the thing was made, but both involved someone getting murdered. Well, like I told you before, it's a giant mass of black fur, with bat wings and claws like a bird. And there's a huge face that should be where a normal man's body should be." George gave a sigh. "Well, there was only one story of one of these things being defeated. Not killed, but driven away. Yeah, the story's something about a woman who somehow tricked the thing into eating hot coals from a fire." George checked his shotgun to make sure it was still loaded. "But I don't want to just drive this son of a bitch away. I want it dead. I want to see the life drain from its infernal eyes, and to know that it was me who killed it." Jeremy watched George's hand grip tightly around his gun before suddenly relaxing. He looked up to see George looking at him. "I know you don't really believe me, and I'm thankful for you for going out of your way to come with me on this hunt, even though you don't believe a word I say." George's eyes narrowed. "But I saw this thing, Jeremy. I almost got close enough to touch it. It wanted me close. It wanted me to have hope that I could save little Jim before snuffing out his life. This wasn't no wild animal. There was cruelty and malice in those eyes." Jeremy sighed. "George, I want to believe you, but you ask me to cast aside years of growing up and belief that there are things that go bump in the night. I thank God I haven't met many monsters, but the few I have are all human. I can't process the idea that some old Indian legend has just popped out of nowhere and claimed a victim. Well, if these things exist, why haven't there been more of them? You say they spring up when someone gets murdered, but murder had been happening since the birth of our country, even before that. Shouldn't there have been at least one other person who claimed they saw what you saw?" George was silent a moment before responding. "And yet, people go missing in the woods every year. Some you find alive, some you find mangled, and others still the police can't find even a trace of. Maybe there's something more hiding in the trees, more than anyone wants to believe. So they don't." George shrugged. "I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers, Jeremy. I'm not going to pretend to even have a few answers. All I know is what I saw, what I read, and what I was told." George stood up then. "Come on, we should get moving. Got a lot of ground to cover still." For hours the two men trekked through the forest, looking for something only one believed was there. It was slow going, as the path George had created on his maps didn't translate well to the actual terrain. Jeremy had to admit that being out in the woods, mostly untouched by man, was very nice, but the hot summer and the idea of their quarry and the misery surrounding it blotted out any ideas about the beautiful trees and the sweet sounds of bird calls. Even with a fire of revenge burning in his soul, George's physical body could not keep up the pace they'd set. It was mid-afternoon, and they were only about halfway done going east when George stopped the two for a rest. After chugging down some water and eating some crackers and canned fruit, George told Jeremy that they were just going to head to the coordinates and forget the spiral. You've been tiptoeing around why you want to go to that location, Jeremy said, accusation seeping into his tone. George, I'm here helping you try and hunt a giant flying head. You can tell me why you want to go to that random spot of nowhere. It's not going to change anything. George sighed, too tired to argue back or keep his reasons secret. When I visited the reservation, he began, I told the medicine man or whomever that I talked to where my family home was. He told me that he believed that this spot, you remember that Indian girl who went missing 2 years ago, right? He said he saw visions that this spot is where she was killed. Jeremy knew instantly what and who George was talking about. 2 years ago, a young, pretty intelligent native girl, just barely 18, went missing from the reservation. Her name was Lily Tarbell. With pressure from the reservation, a massive manhunt had begun in search of her. Tensions were raised when it was discovered from her diary that she'd been sneaking behind her parents and seeing an older white man who lived somewhere in the nearby counties. Well, the man was searched for, but the diary didn't give enough physical description or any location to where he lived, so he was never found. Since no body was ever found either, optimists believed the two would simply run off together somewhere, but that opinion was held by few and far between. The whole thing had been a nightmare, and Jeremy rubbed his temples just remembering the headaches he'd had over the whole ordeal. Hold on a minute. You're telling me that some Indian medicine man, smoking God knows what, told you he had visions of that young missing girl who was killed at that exact spot? You're trying to tell me that she has some connection with this flying head thing that ate little Jim? George nodded. An Indian creature of legend that's created by murder, coming from a place where an Indian girl was murdered. Can you think of any better connection, Jeremy? Jeremy started to say something but stopped. If you believed in monsters and magic and fairies and shit like that, then yes, it did kind of make sense. Jeremy just ended up sighing, and with resignation said, Lead on, George. By the time the two men reached the location of the coordinates, the sun was almost near setting. There was still plenty of light, however, illuminating a natural clearing that was quite the sight to behold. A couple of large stones stood at different points within the clearing, the largest reaching to about 10 feet into the sky. The clearing itself was almost perfectly round, with a diameter of about 60 feet. Grass was the only vegetation that grew in the circle, aside from the moss that grew on some of the stones. Jeremy thought it would be a neat little picnic spot to take the girlfriend he eventually planned on getting. One look at George got him worried, though. He seemed to pale at the sight of the place, and looked like he didn't want to enter the clearing. You all right? Jeremy asked. Yeah, just my gut tells me this place isn't as nice as it seems, George replied. The two men separated to search the clearing more thoroughly. George went to the stones and casually called to Jeremy that he was going to get a campfire going in the middle. Jeremy ended up patrolling the outside rim of the circle. He was looking down at the ground and the trees that grew almost uniformly at the edge of the clearing. It was very strange, but he wasn't a scientist and was sure there was a logical explanation for it. He was about 2/3 done circling the place when the trunk of a large oak tree caught his attention. It was far thicker and bigger than the others, and he followed the trunk upwards with his eyes to see how tall the tree was. That was when he noticed some strange markings in the bark near one of the branches about 15 feet off the ground. The markings were large enough to be noticed from his height, but too high to make out any details. "George, you got any binoculars in these packs of yours?" Jeremy called to him, and George was at his side in seconds. After sifting through his pack, George produced a set of binoculars. "What do you see?" he asked breathlessly. "Not sure. There's some strange markings up there by that branch." Jeremy pointed out the markings to George. "You want to take a quick peek, see what the hell they are?" George lifted the binoculars to his eyes and studied the markings, while Jeremy stole a sidelong glance at his face. His eyes widened with shock as George's face twisted into one of surprise, then terror, and finally rage. When he lowered the binoculars, Jeremy could see dark hatred alight in his eyes. George handed Jeremy the binoculars and, with a whisper like an adder's hiss, said, "Take a look for yourself." Jeremy brought the binoculars up to his eyes and took a look. The markings were crude, as if their carver didn't have much skill in making them, but they were still clear as day. A stick figure, a slightly small stick figure, and 3 even smaller ones were carved into the oak. The smallest stick figure had a large X through it, and was stained with some dark substance. Maybe it was sap from the torn bark, but a sinking feeling in his stomach told Jeremy it wasn't sap. He could feel the blood drain from his face as he brought the binoculars down from his eyes and looked at George, who had a strange smile. "Not sounding so crazy now, is it?" he said softly. Night soon fell, and the 2 men sat around the campfire that they'd made in silence. The food George had brought was forgotten, as both men's appetites had escaped them after their earlier discovery. Both men's nerves were on edge, and despite the heat from the fire, it was taking almost all of their willpower not to shiver. Jeremy was not fully convinced, at least that was what he told himself, but there was a nagging question rumbling in his mind about the whole situation. "Why you?" he asked George without taking his eyes from the fire. "Why does all this shit have to happen to you and me?" George shook his head slightly as he continued staring into the flames. "I don't know, Jeremy. I'm not going to pretend to be a saint, but I don't think we deserved anything that has happened. May didn't deserve to have her youngest taken from her, and little Jim didn't deserve to, He paused for a moment, holding back tears and clearing his throat of a sob. "You know, he cried out for me to save him, Jeremy. Before those jaws and teeth closed around him, he screamed that he was scared and he didn't want to die. That thing wanted him to die in terror. No matter what it takes, I'm going to kill it." Jeremy was going to respond when he noticed something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The forest surrounding them had gone completely silent. A sudden shriek echoed from the trees, and both men stood up in alarm. No matter the bravado George had just spoken of, Jeremy could see him quaking as he stood with the shotgun pointed up into the dark of the treetops. Jeremy had never heard a cry like that from any animal before, and the pain and anguish that resonated within the unearthly howl was almost human. "What the fuck was that?" Jeremy swore aloud as he grabbed a flashlight from one of the packs. Pointing it into the treetops with his .357 aimed at the center of the light beam, he began to scan the tops of the trees for whatever had made the sound. "It made that sound when it went after little Jim," George said, his teeth starting to chatter out of fear. "It killed my son. Now it wants to kill me." "Shut up, man. Look," Jeremy hissed, trying to keep George as calm as he could. Try as he might, he could see the light of panic envelop George's eyes. George raised his shotgun and fired blindly into the night, scaring the crap out of Jeremy only a few feet away. "You fucking bitch. Little Jim didn't do nothing to you." But silence was the only answer George received. After a few tense moments, Jeremy lowered his flashlight and gun and gave George an angry glare. "God damn it, George. You scared the shit out of me. I'm sure that was just the howl of a bobcat or some other animal. Don't just fire your gun like that willy-nilly." George still looked about the top of the trees in fright, but slowly lowered his shotgun. "No, that was the same cry she made that night. I'm sure of it." He began reloading his shotgun. "There's no way I would ever forget that cry." Jeremy was about to respond when, over the crackle and roar of the fire, he heard the sound of wings beating somewhere in the dark sky. He spun around, pointing his flashlight and revolver up into the trees. His beam just caught the end of something moving back into the cover of the night. Jeremy didn't see much, but he swore he saw something big with shaggy black fur before it disappeared. George must have seen it too, for in a panic he lifted the now loaded shotgun again and fired at where the thing had been. Small splinters of wood rained down from where the pellets tore through the branches. Jeremy's ears rang from the blast, and after a few moments of gritting his teeth from the loud noise, he turned on George and roared in his face. "What the hell is wrong with you? Stop shooting at random shadows in the night." George didn't even acknowledge Jeremy. He was too busy trying to reload his shotgun with hands shaking like he had Parkinson's. "You stupid bitch," he cried out into the night, dropping one of the shells as he frantically tried to load the gun. "You just couldn't leave me alone. You just can't leave me alone, can you?" Jeremy stared at George. "What the hell are you talking about?" he asked as the ringing died down and he began to hear the sounds of the night again, or lack thereof. George looked at Jeremy, and though his eyes were filled with fear and panic, Jeremy saw no madness in them. "She's back for me, even when I told her I loved May. Even when I told her what we'd done was a mistake. Oh, she wouldn't leave me alone. She... He was cut off by a loud wail from up in the trees not 50 feet from them. Turning again, Jeremy shone his light into the trees. What he saw caused his mouth to gape and George to emit a low moan of terror. It looked like a massive ball of obsidian black fur about 9 feet in height. If it wasn't for the light from the flashlight, there would have been no way to tell the difference between the darkness of the fur and the night. Sprouting from the lower section were 2 massive legs that looked just like the legs of a hawk, only way bigger. The feet that gripped the branch the thing was resting on were equipped with massive talons that curved in and easily sliced into the wood that housed the massive creature. Large, leathery bat wings were extended out behind, open as though it was about to take flight. The worst thing about it, however, was the large face sticking out from the fur that took up most of the space where a normal human's head and body would be. The face was horrible, and it was human, yet it was not. The eyes were large, black, fiery coals that burned with an intense hatred at what they saw. The mouth was large and twisted into an open snarl, revealing large white teeth shaped like knives, looking just as sharp. A large open gash adorned the forehead. Dry blood caked all around it. The odd thing was, besides the obvious demonic features the face possessed, along with the wound that adorned it, was that the face could have been beautiful. The skin was flawless, the cheeks and jawline complemented each other well, and the nose was petite, comparatively. This was a back thought in Jeremy's mind, though, as the 2 main thoughts that occupied it were, "Holy Mother of God, what the fuck is that thing?" And, I recognize this face from somewhere. George's voice brought Jeremy back to the present. "I told you, it was a mistake," he called up to the creature. "I told you I love May. I told you I love my family. You just couldn't let it go. You forced me to do it. You wanted me to ruin my life." He pointed the shotgun up at the creature and fired off the one barrel that was loaded. The pellets ripped into the creature's flesh, and it let out a howl that shook the night. Quicker than a monster that size should have been able to, it took off into the darkness behind it and disappeared into the night. After a moment of collecting their breath, Jeremy turned to George. He may have been raised in a rural area. He may not have a PhD in psychology, but he wasn't an idiot. "George, what the hell were you talking about? Who was that thing?" Jeremy already had an idea of what was going on, but he didn't want to believe it. His belief that monsters didn't exist was already shattered. He didn't want another belief, that George was a good man and a faithful husband, be cast aside that night as well. disappointment and despair flooded him when George pointed to one of the large rocks without breaking his gaze from the space the flying head last occupied. She's buried there, he said, a strange calmness emanating from his voice. She's in a large burlap sack about 3 feet down. At this, he turned and faced Jeremy, tears beginning to fall from his cheeks. We were going through a bad time, Jeremy. I thought May was going to get a divorce. I just wanted to have a fling, but she wanted more. I couldn't resist. She was so young and beautiful. When May and I patched things up after a few months, I told her I wanted out. But she threatened to tell May about her and I, so... Her name's Lily Tarbell. Jeremy cut in coldly. And she's been missing for 2 years. I remember searching these woods for her, seeing her parents crying out for her. I remember long days of trying to find a young woman whose grave I'm now standing on. Jeremy stomped over to George and got in his face, shouting. I remember May crying, scared from your drinking habit. I remember her saying you'd beaten it. Now you were the perfect husband and father. Now here we are, your youngest son dead and us in the middle of the forest with a monster because you're a cheater and a murderer. Jeremy couldn't contain his anger anymore and decked George in the face with a fist holding his flashlight. George stumbled back and fell on his ass right next to the fire. He winced in pain from the blow, but didn't make any attempt of rebuke or rebuttal. He just sat next to the fire and stared at the ground. You're right, Jeremy. It's my fault that all this happened. There are a million things I shouldn't have done that I can't take back. He looked up from the ground, and Jeremy saw the determination in his eyes he'd seen back in the barn. I deserve punishment, but little Jim didn't. He was innocent in all this, yet this thing that wears Lily's face killed him. This unholy abomination took its anger out on a child. You can arrest me when we get back. I don't care. I'll confess to anything you want, but help me send this devil back to hell first, for May's sake. Jeremy didn't want to admit it, but he had a point. Before either man had a chance to move or even speak, a loud whooshing sound echoed around them, and a large shape swooped down onto George's body. Jeremy was too shocked at the sight of the massive maw engulfing George to try and shoot the thing. George had a little more reaction, screaming as the fanged mouth enveloped him. Maybe out of reflex, maybe out of remembrance of the legend, George managed to grab a stick from the fire and thrust it into the mouth of the flying head with him. Almost immediately the fur and face burst into flames, but this did not deter the creature from its task, and a moment later George's head disappeared into the humongous mouth with the teeth clamping shut behind it. Her task complete, the flying head began to succumb to the pain of the flames and flew off into the night, shrieking in both agony and triumph. Jeremy watched the flying ball of fire disappear into the sky, slack-jawed, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Soon, all Jeremy heard was the sounds of the fire crackling and the crickets' chirps returning to the night air. It took him a few minutes to regain his composure, and even then he was still shaking over the events that had just occurred. Jeremy stayed awake the entire night, and when morning came, he rooted around the packs George had brought in the light of day. Besides food and water, Jeremy found rope, knives, a large burlap sack, and a shovel. Jeremy would never know the truth, but he guessed that these tools were probably meant for him, if he discovered the truth about Lily and George survived. He took the shovel and dug where George had told him. Sure enough, Jeremy soon uncovered a large burlap sack like the one in the pack, and the stench of decay told him he'd discovered Lily's body. Today was going to be one hell of a day for him. He started back towards the Williams farmhouse with George's map in hand. Jeremy knew he needed to make a couple of phone calls. He was going to tell everyone that guilt from Lily's murder had finally broken George, that George had broken down during the night at their campsite and told Jeremy where Lily was buried. As Jeremy had tried to calm him down and bring him into custody, George had fled into the dark of the woods. He knew there'd be a massive manhunt, and when the church turned up empty, suspicious eyes would be turned onto him. But there was no other thing to do. He certainly couldn't say a flying head from native Mohawk legend enacted its justly revenge on an adulterous murderer. To May, and only May, he would tell the truth, and hopefully she'd believe him, not blame or hate him for what had happened. Even if she did, she deserved to know the truth, no matter how crazy it sounded. A shrill cry caused Jeremy to stop dead in his tracks. He whipped out his gun and looked all around the tops of the trees, trying to find the source of the call. Finally, he spotted a crow, staring down at him from one of the tall pines behind him. He could tell its black beady eyes were dead set upon him, eyes that were as black as that thing he'd seen in the night. He'd heard crow calls all his life, but never had one sounded like what he had just heard. But the crow didn't move or call out again. It just sat and watched him. Jeremy gradually holstered his gun and began to slowly continue walking. The crow watched him go, and Jeremy continued to stare at the bird till it vanished from sight. He then began to pick up his pace and jog through the woods, wanting to get out of the trees as fast as possible, and planning to never return to that forest again. Wow. Damn, that was good. I'll tell you what, I've been finding some brilliant stories written by you guys on my subreddit recently, and for that I thank you all from the bottom of my heart. Really, really, it's a privilege to read good stories like that. It really is. So thank you for sharing them with me. And on that note, I should mention that that was originally shared with me back in December 2018, almost 2 years ago, and somehow I managed to completely overlook it at the time, and I only just rediscovered it yesterday, and I knew that I had to read it all for you. So, what did you think? And if you've shared something on this subreddit, and I haven't got around to reading it, there is a chance that this crazy old disorganized fool just missed it. So, if there's something you've posted on there, feel free to post it again, alright? I may just have not seen it at the time, okay? Get hundreds of stories, and I do try to read as many of them as I can, and a lot of them are just fantastically brilliant, but there is a chance I'll miss some of them. So, sorry in advance if I haven't got round to your story yet. Do yourself a favour, do me a favour, post it again, alright? Well, that's enough for one evening. The podcast second episode is out and about. Doing very well. So if you're not familiar with that, I'm posting them Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere where you get your podcasts, and also as a YouTube video on my second channel. So you've got no excuse. Well, enough for me for one evening, but I'll be back again very soon. Till the next time, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye.